The assembly hall of Valdenmore's royal court had been designed to make a person feel small. Its ceilings rose 40 feet above the marble floor, and the candles in their silver chandeliers threw a light that was neither warm nor kind, only abundant. Cecily Wren stood at the room's edge, her hands folded at her waist, her sage-green Spencer jacket somewhat plain against the embroidered court dress of the 60 nobles arranged in 2 careful rows before the dais. She was not dressed for this occasion. She had not been told she would be admitted to it. She had been told to wait with the children in the antechamber. She had waited exactly long enough to hear the doors open and the herald announce that the king would deliver his declaration on the matter of succession. Then she had walked in. No one had stopped her. No one had thought to. She was, after all, only the English nursemaid. King Aldrich of Valdenmoor sat on the carved chair at the room's far end as though the chair were an extension of his spine, as though he had been built for it, rather than placed in it. He was 60 years old, his hair gone to silver, his court coat weighted with decoration, and he wore his authority the way some men wore their skin, as though it had never been questioned. He had been speaking when she entered. He did not pause. His eyes moved to her for 1/2 of 1 second, catalogued her, and dismissed her, with a precision that was worse, somehow, than open contempt. August Hartwell, Duke of Valdenmoor, stood 4 rows back among the gathered lords. He did not look at her either. His face was as still as cut stone, and his hands were clasped behind his back, and Cecily, who had spent 18 months learning to read the small betrayals of that face, understood that he was working very hard not to look at her. The king completed his sentence. It is therefore the finding of this court, and of our royal authority, that our beloved son, Crown Prince Edmund, departed this life without legitimate issue. The succession of Valdenmoor passes, in accordance with established law, and by our royal appointment to our cousin's son, Lord Ferrix, whom we name here, and publicly as our designated heir. Cecily's heart did not race. She noted this with a kind of distant wonder. Her heart was very quiet, and her hands were very still, and the leather case through the fabric of her bodice pressed against her ribs like a warm hand. "Your Majesty," she said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurred when a person without rank spoke in a room organized entirely around rank. It was not hostile, exactly. It was more like the silence of a room, in which a piece of furniture had unexpectedly produced a human voice. The king looked at her again. This time he did not look away. His expression was the expression of a man addressing something unfortunate that had appeared on an otherwise clean floor. "You have no business in this room," he said, "and you have no heir to present to it." He paused. The corners of his mouth moved not quite into a smile, into something that wore the shape of one. "You have no heir," he said. "You have nothing." "No," Cecily said. "I have something better." She turned. The antechamber doors were still open behind her. She walked toward them. The room did not breathe. And then she put her hand on the nursery door, the one that connected directly to the side passage, where she had left Leopold and Marta in the keeping of their nurse, and she opened it. The 2 children who walked through it were 3 years old, fair-haired, and dressed in white muslin that their nurse had pressed that morning without knowing why. Leopold held his sister's hand. Marta looked at the candles. The room breathed. 18 months before that morning, Cecily had been a companion to the late Princess Isolde of Valdenmoor, which was a position that sounded more dignified than it was. She had read aloud, she had kept correspondence. She had managed the small household accounts with the kind of quiet competence that went entirely unnoticed until the day it was absent. When Isolde died in childbed, carrying a child that did not survive her, the principality had been in the first shock of its grief for the Crown Prince Edmund, who had fallen in battle 6 weeks prior. 2 griefs arriving together produced a kind of moral numbness in a court, and in that numbness, people stopped asking certain questions. The question no one had thought to ask was the one that mattered most. The morning before Edmund rode out, he had sent for her. She had thought it concerned the household accounts. It concerned, instead, a letter. He was not a man given to drama or to speeches. He was young, 26, and he wore his responsibility, as new things are worn, carefully and with visible effort. He had placed a sealed letter in her hands, and told her that if he did not return, she was to take what was in the East Nursery and bring it to August Hartwell, Duke of Valdenmoor, who would know what to do. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she would not be able to name until much later. Then he had thanked her, which a prince was not required to do, and she had felt in that moment the particular weight of being trusted with something that mattered by someone who understood that it mattered. He did not return. She had gone to the East Nursery that evening and found Leopold and Marta in their cradles asleep, watched over by a nurse who had been told to speak of them to no one. She understood then what the letter was for, and what the secrecy was for, and what the silence was for. She had taken the letter, and the children and the nurse, and she had gone, in the dark, in a borrowed carriage with no crest, to the estate of the Duke of Valdenmoor, arriving at 3:30 in the morning, with wet shoes and dry eyes, and no plan beyond the one Edmund had given her. He had opened the door himself. He was not dressed for visitors. His coat was absent, his cravat loose, and he looked as though he had not slept in several days, which was accurate. He looked at her, he looked at the children. Something in his face moved, and then was immediately controlled the way a hand is placed flat against a table to stop it shaking. "Come in," he said, and that was all. She had misread his silence in those first weeks as coldness. It was easy to do. He did not speak to her at meals, unless spoken to. He walked past the nursery without stopping. He issued instructions about the household through the housekeeper, and instructions about the children through their nurse, so that Cecily, who was by then performing the work of a governess rather than a companion, existed in the estate like a person in a room with the walls pushed slightly back, present, but not quite arrived. She told herself it did not trouble her. She was not there to be spoken to. She was there to keep Leopold and Marta fed and safe and as ordinary as two children carrying a secret inheritance could possibly be. It troubled her. The estate at Valdenmoor was large enough that two people who wished to avoid each other could do so with complete success. Cecily did not precisely wish to avoid him. She had no particular claim on his attention, and no standing from which to seek it. And she simply occupied the nursery wing and the kitchen passage, and on cold afternoons the small parlor near the library. And if his footsteps were sometimes audible on the other side of the library wall while she was reading to the children, that was the architecture's arrangement and not any intention of his. She had learned, in those first weeks, to read the estate's rhythms. He rose before 6, walked the grounds alone in the early dark, and was at his desk by the time the household properly stirred. He took his meals with the kind of efficient solitude that suggested eating was a necessary inconvenience. He had a steward, a woman named Marsh, who was 60 and unimpressible, and who managed the house with the same quiet competence Cecily had once applied to the princess's correspondence, and it was through Marsh that the household conducted most of its actual communication. Through Marsh, Cecily requested additional blankets for the nursery. Through Marsh, she arranged for the children's laundry to be managed separately from the household's, so as not to cause questions among the lower staff. Through Marsh, she asked whether there was a physician in the nearest town who could be trusted, in the event of illness, not to speak of his patients to interested parties. Marsh had looked at her for a long moment, and then said that there was such a physician, and that the Duke used him for all the estate's medical needs, and that she would send his direction by the evening post. She had not thanked August for this. She had not known it was his doing, and not Marsh's. She would learn only later that every arrangement Marsh made on the children's behalf had been quietly authorized by the Duke first, often before Cecily had thought to request it. He noticed the children on a morning in January. She knew it was January because the frost on the nursery windows had that particular thickness. That meant the temperature had not risen above freezing for 3 days running. She had brought the children down to the small parlor near the library because the fire there was larger, and Leopold was coughing in the thin air of the nursery, and she had made a judgment that a coughing child mattered more than the household's preferences, about which rooms the governess used. She had settled them with picture books and was reading aloud when she heard the library door open and the Duke's footsteps stop. She did not look up. She kept reading. He stood at the parlor threshold for 30 seconds. She knew because she counted without looking, her voice steady on the text, while Leopold leaned his small warm weight against her arm, and Marta turned the pages at a speed that bore no relationship to the pace of reading. Outside the parlor window, snow had been falling since morning. The fire made a small particular sound, a crack and then a settle, and Leopold's breath rose and fell against her sleeve. He said nothing. He went back to the library. But that evening, without announcement or explanation, the nursery fire was built larger than it had been since their arrival, and a second nurse was engaged, and a letter appeared on the hall table addressed to a physician in the nearest town, asking about remedies for winter coughs in small children. He had not spoken to her about it. He never did. This was. She would understand, much later, the way the Duke spoke most plainly, in the arrangements he made and not the words he used. There were 2 other moments of that kind, in the months that followed. Once, when Leopold had set up a small cry at the sound of a carriage in the drive, something he had done since the night of their flight, August, appeared at the nursery door before the nurse could reach him, stood at the threshold until the child quieted, and then went away again without entering the room. The second time was in the kitchen garden in late February, when Cecily had brought the children out for air, and Marta had fallen on the garden path and cut her knee, a small and ordinary injury, and Cecily had knelt in the mud to assess the damage. Her dress entirely unsuited to the mud, and when she looked up, August was at the kitchen garden gate. He was too far to have heard the fall. She never knew what had brought him to the gate at that moment. He assessed the scene, determined the injury was minor, and inclined his head in what might have been acknowledgment and might have been relief, and turned back toward the house. Marta, who was recovering her composure at a pace she considered satisfactory, watched him go with the particular attention small children give to people who interest them without explanation. If you find yourself moved by Cecily's quiet courage, stay with her. A little longer. She is not finished yet. Lord Ferrex arrived at the estate on a Thursday in February, calling it a diplomatic courtesy and bringing with him 2 advisers and a quantity of self-possession that took up more room in a hallway than a man that size had any right to occupy. He was 40, lean, with the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of amiable authority, and Cecily disliked him immediately in the specific way she disliked people who moved through rooms as though the rooms had been designed for their arrival. She was crossing the hall when his arrival was announced and had no option but to acknowledge it. He looked at her with the particular assessment of a man cataloging the household's minor figures. His gaze stopped, calculated her station, and moved on. He said to his companion, in a voice pitched for the companion's ears, but not carefully enough for the corridor's acoustics, "The English nursemaid, I take it." August always did surround himself with stray obligations. His companion agreed, quietly, and they were shown to the drawing room. Cecily went upstairs. Leopold was building a tower of wooden blocks in the center of the nursery floor, and Marta was instructing him on where to place each one with the particular authority of a child who has decided she is in charge of the situation. The nurse sat sewing by the window. Everything was ordinary. Cecily sat on the low chair beside the blocks and watched Leopold place a piece where Marta had pointed and felt the dull knowledge, settling in her chest like sediment, that the man downstairs believed himself to be the solution to a problem that Leopold and Marta represented without knowing it. She stayed until they were asleep that evening. She always did. It was a week after Ferrex's visit that she understood what the Duke had been doing in those months of silence. She had been in the kitchen garden in the late afternoon, the twins playing at a safe distance on the path, while she spoke with the cook about the following week's provisions, when a carriage arrived, carrying a court official. A man in formal Valdenmoor livery, with a leather satchel, and the compressed expression of someone who had traveled in an uncomfortable carriage for too many hours. He asked to see the children. He said it was a routine matter. He said the word routine in the way that people say routine when they mean the opposite. She brought him to the parlor. He looked at Leopold and Marta for a long time with an expression that had something calculating behind its official blankness. Then he said, conversationally and entirely without emotion, that there were families in the northern provinces, comfortable families with good houses, where children of uncertain documentation sometimes settled very well. That the record-keeping in those districts was somewhat looser than in the court's formal registers. That it might be simpler for everyone if certain questions were resolved by geography rather than by law. Cecily had looked at him for a moment. Leopold was at the window. Marta was asleep on the small settee with her hand curled beneath her chin. "I think you should leave," Cecily said. He raised his eyebrows. "I beg your pardon." "I think," she said, "that you should collect your satchel, return to your carriage, and convey to whoever sent you that these children are not uncertain documentation. They are not a question to be resolved by geography. They are Edmund's children. I will not be moving them to a comfortable family in a northern province. I will not be doing so next week, or the week after, or on any instruction from any official in any livery. Do I make myself plain?" The official opened his mouth. Cecily looked at him with the expression of a woman who has slept 4 hours a night for 16 months and has arrived, through that deprivation, at a state of absolute clarity about which things matter and which things do not. He closed his mouth. He gathered his satchel. He left. She had not known August was in the corridor. She did not know it until that evening, when she came downstairs to find a letter on the hall table, this time addressed to the court's legal registrar in the capital, the one who held the official records of the principality's succession. It was sealed with the Duke's crest. She did not open it, but she held it in her hands for a moment and felt its weight. She set it on the table with great care and went back upstairs. The night he told her about the battlefield was the night she found him in the library, at past 11 o'clock, not reading, not writing, sitting at the library table with a small painted miniature in his hand and his eyes on the middle distance, the candle burning low beside him. She should have withdrawn. She had come for a book and had not expected the room to be occupied, and the correct thing was to take her book and excuse herself and leave him to whatever private accounting he was conducting. She took the book from the shelf. She did not leave. "You are still awake," he said. He had not looked at her. "So are you," she said. He set the miniature on the table. It was Edmund, painted on ivory in the small oval style, perhaps 22 years old, in the portrait wearing his formal dress, with an expression of someone trying not to smile at whoever was painting him. "I ordered the line to hold," August said. At the engagement at the ridge he had ridden ahead, and the line was exposed, and I gave the order to hold position and wait for the artillery support, rather than advancing to pull him back. Cecily was very still. He held the position for 11 minutes. The artillery came 7 minutes too late. He picked up the miniature and put it down again. I have gone through those 11 minutes a great many times. She understood then why the nursery fire had been built larger. She understood why he had sent the letter to the physician. She understood why he had written to the legal registrar, and why he stood at the edge of rooms where she and the children were, and then went back to his library. He was paying a debt he believed he owed in the only currency available to him, which was protection. Methodical, wordless, absolute protection. He wrote the letter the morning before the battle, she said. He gave it to me before he left. Before you gave the order. He had already decided to trust you with everything before a single position was held. The room was very quiet. He knew, she said, not unkindly, that you would do exactly what the situation required. That is why he trusted you with his children. Not because he thought you were infallible, because he knew you would try. Something in his face changed. Then it was not large. It would not have been visible to anyone who had not spent 18 months learning the particular grammar of that face. It was a small change, like the moment when ice over a river shifts, not yet broken, but no longer entirely solid. His hand was on the table, 3 inches from the miniature. She did not move toward him. She was very conscious of the precise distance between them, of the warmth of the candle on the side of her face, of the sound of the house settling around them in the cold. He chose well, August said at last, and what he meant by it was not entirely clear, but his eyes had moved to her, and they stayed there. She excused herself and went upstairs and lay awake for a considerable time, listening to the house and to the sound of her own heartbeat, which was doing something she was not prepared to examine directly. The summons came in March, bearing the king's seal, and it was not, by the terms of its language, a request. Cecily and the children were to appear before a court commission tasked with assessing, as the document phrased it, matters pertaining to documentation of the late Crown Prince's household dependents. The word dependent appeared 3 times. The word children did not appear at all. August read the letter at breakfast. He folded it with great precision and set it beside his cup. "We will go together," he said. Ferrex was in the court's antechamber the afternoon before the formal assembly, speaking quietly to a man Cecily did not recognize, and she passed them at sufficient proximity to catch the shape of what was being said without the precise words. She heard enough. The English nursemaid was making difficulties. That was the phrase, making difficulties, as though presenting 2 living legitimate heirs of the crown was an act of personal inconvenience rather than a matter of law. She had said nothing. She had walked past them with the children's hands in hers and taken them to the room assigned to their use, which was smaller and colder than it should have been. And she had spent the evening reading to them until they slept. She did not sleep herself. She sat in the chair beside the bed they shared, Leopold and Marta, listening to the sounds of the court building around her, the footsteps in distant corridors, the low voices of officials passing outside the door, the mechanical sound of a kingdom managing itself. She had carried the secret of those 2 children for 18 months. She had managed post-chaise schedules and physicians' visits, and the very particular diplomatic silence required when a court official asked polite questions about the nursery's residents, and the answers must be simultaneously true and unrevealing. She had done it without help except August's, and August's help had been offered in the way he offered everything, sideways and wordless, through arrangements rather than statements. She had not let herself think, in those 18 months, about what would happen when the moment came. There had been too much to manage in the days themselves. But now she sat in the quiet and thought about it plainly. The letter in its leather case was in her bodice. She had rehearsed the moment of presenting it perhaps 200 times. She had imagined many versions of the court's response. In most of those imagined versions, August had been beside her. She pressed her fingers flat against the leather case through the fabric of her dress. Leopold had thrown one arm across his sister in his sleep, and Marta had accepted this without waking. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would not regret having brought them here. That much was very clear and very simple. It was late when August knocked at the door of her sitting room. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain. Not quite uncertain. He looked like a man who has completed a calculation and does not like its result. He told her then what the king had said to him privately, that if August interfered, if he presented the letter or supported the children's claim in any public manner, the king would find the grounds to bring a charge of interference with the succession against the dukedom, that the estate at Valdenmoor would be reviewed for irregularities of tenure, that a duke, who involved himself in what the king described as a nursemaid's delusion, might find himself without a dukedom to return to. Cecily looked at him. "And what did you say?" she asked. He was silent for a moment. "I said I would consider it." She understood. She understood it fully, and without sentiment. He was not abandoning her. He was calculating what he could preserve. A duke without a dukedom had no leverage. A man who had already lost his estate could protect nothing. This was the way of it. She had known, had always known, that she was standing on ground that belonged to someone else, and that when the ground shifted she would stand on whatever remained beneath her own feet. She thanked him. She meant it. After he had gone, she sat for a long time with the leather case in her lap, the letter inside it, and she thought about what Edmund had looked like the morning he gave it to her. She thought about the way he had thanked her. She put the case inside the bodice of her gown, against her ribs, where it had lived for 18 months, and she went to sleep. The assembly hall the following morning held 60 nobles, the court's chief magistrate in his formal gray coat, and King Aldrich on his carved chair, and it held the Duke 4 rows back with his hands clasped behind him, his face like stone over a very deep river. The king gave his declaration. The king sneered at the English nursemaid who had thought to interrupt a royal court. The king said she had no heir to present and nothing to bring before this room. And she had turned, and she had walked to the nursery door, and she had opened it. Leopold and Marta stood in the doorway, and the room went completely still. And into that stillness Cecily walked, not toward the king, but to the center of the room where the candlelight was strongest. And she reached into her bodice and withdrew the leather case and opened it, and the letter was inside it. She held it out to the court's chief magistrate. This is a letter in the hand of Crown Prince Edmund of Valdenmoor, written on the 17th of September 1817, the morning before his death. It is witnessed by 3 members of his household, whose names are given in the text. It names Leopold Edmund Hartley and Marta Isolde Hartley as his legitimate children, born in lawful marriage to the Princess Isolde, who died in April last year. I asked that it be read aloud. The king began to speak. The magistrate, whose name was Reinhardt, and who had been the principality's chief legal authority for 31 years, and who had never in those 31 years permitted a political statement to interrupt a legal reading, opened the letter and began to read. The room listened. The king's voice did not stop. Exactly. It was more that it ceased to penetrate anything. The magistrate read in a clear, unhurried voice, and the words filled the hall's 40-foot ceiling and came back down, and Lord Ferrex, 3 rows from the front, stood very still with his hands at his sides. When the magistrate had finished, the king rose. He said the letter was irregular. He said the documentation was incomplete. He said that a nursemaid's word regarding a letter of uncertain provenance was not sufficient basis for a succession claim. He said it with great authority and considerable volume. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He was not hurrying. He moved with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, crossing from his position at the 4th row to the center of the floor where Cecily stood, and he stopped beside her, and he took her hand. Her gloved hand in his bare one, in front of 60 witnesses, in front of the king, in front of Lord Ferrex, who went very still at the room's edge. The king stopped speaking. "These are Edmund's children," August said. His voice was level, the words measured, the way he said everything. Cecily Wren is their guardian. The room did not breathe. He held her hand. His thumb moved once, very slightly, against her gloved knuckle, a motion so small that no one in the room could have seen it except her. She felt it with the whole of her attention. The king looked at August with the expression of a man recalculating an equation he had believed settled. The threat of the dukedom was in the room with them, hanging in the candlelit air, and everyone who mattered knew it, and August's hand did not loosen. "The dukedom," the king said, "stands as it stands," August said. "And these children stand where they stand. I will not be moving either of them." The chief magistrate, Reinhardt, had spent 31 years finding the procedural path through difficult rooms. He looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at the 2 fair-haired children standing at the nursery door with their nurse, entirely uninstructed in the gravity of their position, Leopold examining a pattern in the marble floor, and Marta looking at the chandeliers. He looked at the king. "The letter is dated, witnessed, and bears the late Crown Prince's private seal," Reinhardt said. "It is the opinion of this court's legal authority that it constitutes a valid instrument of recognition, and that the children named within it have legitimate standing. The matter of succession cannot proceed without addressing their claim." Lord Ferrex did not make a scene. He was too intelligent for that. He simply stepped back, 1 quiet step, and then another, and the space around him widened. The king sat down. He sat down with the particular heaviness of a man whose calculation had been shown, in front of 60 witnesses, to have been built on something that was never there. The assembly did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, and Aldrich was not the kind of king who permitted eruptions. But the quality of the silence changed. It became the silence of a room that has witnessed something that will be reported, carefully and at length, in every drawing room and correspondence and advisement meeting in the principality for the next several months, and everyone in it understood that. Cecily's hand was still in August's. She did not look at him. She looked at Leopold and Marta, who had been brought forward now to stand beside her. Leopold's hand in her free hand, Marta having attached herself to the back of Cecily's skirt. They were not frightened. They were too young to understand that they should be. They were simply present, as children are present entirely and without apology. This is the moment she had carried for 18 months in a leather case against her ribs. It did not feel the way she had imagined. She had imagined relief, clean and final. What she felt was something quieter than that. Something that sat in her chest, where the letter had been, and was warmer and more complicated than relief. The proceeding continued for another 2 hours. Documents were examined, witnesses to the letter's original composition were sent for by post, and formal recognition of the children's standing was entered into the court's official register under Reinhardt's hand. The king remained. His authority demanded it. He sat with the posture of a man who had decided that the performance of composure was the only remaining territory available to him, and he performed it with discipline, if not with grace. Ferrex had gone. The court's nobles did not cheer. This was not that kind of assembly. But the quality of their attention shifted, the way a room shifts when a window is opened in it, some new current running through the arrangement of bodies, and a number of the older lords who had served Edmund's grandfather leaned together in the way of men exchanging a long-held opinion that has been publicly confirmed. A woman near the back of the room, a dowager countess whom Cecily did not know, caught her eye as Reinhardt completed the registration. The woman gave a single, small inclination of her head. Not congratulation, exactly. Recognition. Cecily accepted it as it was intended, and looked back toward the children. Reinhardt formally addressed the assembly at the close, stating that the matter of succession would be reviewed by a panel of the court's senior authorities over the following 30 days, that in the interim the children's claim would stand as registered, and that the hearing was concluded. He said it with the economy of a man who had spent 31 years making consequential pronouncements, and had learned that consequence requires no additional decoration. August stood at Cecily's, right through all of it, and when at last they were released from the hall, and the children were taken in hand by their nurse, and the formal business of the day was concluded, he walked beside her in the corridor, not speaking, until they reached the turn in the passage that led to the family wing. He stopped. She stopped. "What the king threatened," she said. "Your dukedom." "It is my dukedom," he said. "It will survive the displeasure of a man who has just been shown to have built his succession on absent heirs." She looked at him. The corridor was lit by a single sconce, and his face in that light had the quality it sometimes had when he was not bothering to arrange it for anyone, when he was simply as he was. There was the faint scar at his left temple, pale against his skin. There were his gray eyes, which he had spent 18 months learning to read. "You knew," she said, "what it might cost." "I knew what it would cost not to," he said. The sound of the children in the distant wing came faintly down the corridor, Marta's voice, identifying something, and Leopold's answering, the particular ongoing dialogue of two people who have always had each other. She thought of Edmund thanking her. She thought of the morning he had placed the letter in her hands. She thought of what August had said in the library, that he had gone through those 11 minutes a great many times. And she thought of what she had said in return, and how his face had changed. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about the spring. Have you Leopold and Marta will need to be formally settled in their succession. Status in their household." He paused. "There are certain arrangements that would simplify that considerably." "Arrangements," she said. "I am not skilled at this," he said. "I know," she said. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to remain, not as a nursemaid, not as a governess, as—" He stopped. He began again. "As my wife, if you are willing, if it is what you want, and not what the situation requires." The sconce on the wall was burning a little low, and the corridor was quiet, and she could feel the warmth of him at this distance. the careful restraint of the distance he maintained, because he always maintained it, because he was always asking permission without saying so. "It is what I want," she said. "It is not what the situation requires." He lifted her hand, as he had lifted it in the assembly hall, but the room held only the two of them now, and the low sconce and the distant sound of the children, and he turned her hand over, and pressed his mouth, briefly, and with complete attention to the inside of her wrist just above where the glove ended. She held very still, and felt it like a note held on a piano, after the key has been released, resonating in a space that the sound had made larger. That evening, after Leopold and Marta had been bathed and read to and put to bed with Marta's objections duly noted and overruled, Cecily sat for a while in the nursery. After they were asleep, the fire was low. The snow that had been threatening all day had finally begun, soft and without ceremony, to fall outside the window. She could see it in the candle's light, the flakes catching the glow as they passed the glass. She had the leather case in her hands. It was empty now. The letter was in the keeping of Reinhardt's court, registered and sealed and entered into the principality's official record, where it would remain. She ran her thumb along the case's worn stitching, the place where the leather had softened from being held. She set it on the shelf beside the small portrait of Edmund that she had placed there in their first week at the estate, and she looked at it for a moment. She had not understood then what he was thanking her for. Not entirely. She thought she understood it a little better now. Leopold's breathing in the small bed beside his sister was slow and even. Marta had her hand curled under her chin, as she always slept, as if holding something. The candle on the windowsill made a small sphere of light against the snow. August was in the doorway. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of him stopping at the threshold, which was how he arrived everywhere, by stopping at the edge of a room and waiting. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice a key turning in a lock you had forgotten was there. The syllables sat differently in the air than anything he had said to her before because they were not a title or a formality. They were only her, the name her father had given her. In his voice, she looked up. The snow fell past the window behind her, soft and continuous, making no sound. "Come to bed," he said. And what he meant by it was not what he might have meant a year ago, was not distance or instruction, was something else entirely, something she intended to spend a considerable number of years understanding in full. She rose from the chair. She took one last look at the children, and at the leather case on the shelf, and at the candle burning on the windowsill, small and steady against the snow. Then she went to him. "If Cecily's quiet courage has stayed with you, leave a word for her in the comments. She kept faith when it was costly. She deserves to be remembered."